Hello there and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called PROG Snobbery. I did not roll my R's enough, so I'm going to say it again. Right, I'm not very well at the moment. I've got the COVID. You know, I will be milking the fact that I'm not very well on the next few videos so that you all know that I have not been well. I got struck down with the COVID last week. I've been in bed for around about 5 days, I think, you know, trying to get up and shivering and then having to go back to bed. So this is the first constructive thing I've done is create these videos you're watching now. And this one's going to be about, and I'll do it properly, PROG Snobbery, right? PROG Snobbery, okay? Now, just did a video on Genesis, and I got into this a little bit. But that snobbery you get where prog fans go, I hate anything without Peter Gabriel, it's just all shallow pop music and I don't like it, it's not my style of music and all that type of stuff. Right? You could argue that's not snobbery, that's just someone's opinion. And of course we're all entitled to our opinions, aren't we? Even when they're wrong, we're entitled to them. Right? But, and I am joking, I promise you, I'm joking when I say these things. In terms of prog, there's a wider thing, which I think encompasses that Genesis snobbery. But there's a wider idea, wider idea that I have spotted all my life, and I'll explain how I don't have that snobbery, why I think I don't have that snobbery. Right? This is the reason why. I think it goes like this. We discover rock music as kids, and we love it. So we listen to rock music. In listening to rock music, we may start with Iron Maiden, and we might start with, Black Sabbath, Journey, Lynyrd Skynyrd. These are all bands I loved when I was a kid. And when you listen to them, I think, as a youth, you become aware that the musicianship is different in those bands to the bands in the charts, the pop music. Now, straight away, that's not the case. Back in the old days, in many cases, the musicians that were working as session musicians on these pop records were equal, if not greater, than many progressive rock musicians. That's always been the case. If you are Michael Jackson and you were hiring a band, the budgets that you've got, you can hire the best in the world, and you will, and they did, and they still do. So if you want to know where the real virtuosity is, just go and walk up into any pop musician who's had a huge success and look at the musicians in their band. It'll always be the case. It's very similar to when a band loses a player. If you think of a band, and somebody leaves and they bring in somebody else to replace them, that person they bring to replace is usually of a much higher virtuoso level than they are. That they bring in someone that is that can really play. Why? Because they can. If you're auditioning 40, 50, 100 people and they're coming in one after the other, you're going to tick all the boxes. And there's somebody who can play everything and do anything and isn't scratching their head because they can't play the stuff. He's not going to get through. Even though founder members who are integral to the sort of concept of that band may well be. So bands that use session musicians, they're the greatest musicians. If you're Barbra Streisand, you're going to use the greatest musicians. If you're Adele or, Stormzy or any artist that has got budgets and has got some, profile, when they audition, they're going to have the best players walking in. So this is not the case. But bands who can create their own music are able to showcase themselves. They're able to put the spotlight on the band. And so people listen to rock bands, they often go, oh, these guys can really play. And once they become aware of it, they all start listening to this. This is a factor that separates these rock bands from shallow pop music. Oh, these are real players, they can play, they've got feeling, blah, blah, blah. All that that starts to crop in. That's there in all music. But they believe it's there in some greater form in rock music. Oh, Jimmy Page is a genius, Eric Clapton's the best guitarist in the world. All these things start to emerge, these ideas, right? Anybody who gets invested in that will then come across a band like Yes or Rush or Genesis And then when they hear that music, they go, oh my God, this is a 20-minute long track and it's got all these weird timings in it, all these jumps, and it's strange. These musicians must be the best musicians in the world. Right? And this creates these ideas. And it is these ideas that say, for example, that Neil Peart is the greatest drummer that ever lived. You know, he's the greatest rock drummer of all time. Okay? You know, these ideas that, you know, Dave Gilmour's guitar solos have an emotional content that other guitarists haven't got. All right. Well, I think I was the same. You know, I can remember hearing Rush and just going, oh my God, this is at another level. You know, I was trying to learn the instrument, you know, and I'm trying to get my head around Iron Maiden songs, and they were hard enough. And then suddenly you hear Rush and you're trying to get your head around 2112 or, you know, YYZ. And it's like, oh my God, this is so hard. These must be geniuses. They're absolutely genius. Now, I think they are geniuses, and I think the music's brilliant. But not because they're virtuoso musicians. That's not what makes it so great. Right? The world is full of virtuoso musicians. Okay? Now, I didn't quite fall for this when I was a kid, and I'll tell you why. And you're going to hate this, prog fans out there. It's because my dad was a jazz fan. And I'd been brought up on jazz, and I knew what jazz musicians were doing. Right? And if you know what jazz musicians are doing, what they're actually doing, right, you don't think that prog musicians are the best musicians in the world. I've taught music for 30 years now, and it takes a long time to teach music students to the point where they can begin to understand what jazz musicians are doing. Not be able to do it, just get their head round what they are actually doing. And the amount of times I've been sat in a room with a student when the penny drops what jazz musicians can do, and they sort of go, oh my God, do musicians actually do this? All right? Now, I'm sure you're arguing, yes, but some of the great, you know, progressive rock musicians were jazz musicians. Look at Bill Bruford and Steve Howe, they're both jazz musicians. They are. And part of their virtuoso level comes from the fact that they've got that going on. But are those musicians technically at the same level as a Wes Montgomery or a Burley Legrand or a John McLaughlin? No, they're just not. They're not. You know, Bill Bruford's an incredible drummer. Really, really incredible. Is he at the same level as somebody like Tony Williams? I think if he was here, he would say no. What he does on the drums is something else, and it's absolutely fantastic, and we need to get to what that fantastic thing is. But it's not physical, technical virtuosity. Now, I sort of knew that as a kid because I'd grown up listening to jazz musicians. I knew it, you know. I could tell, you know, that Hendrix wasn't doing what Joe Pass does on guitar. You know, I could sort of cobble together something that sounded remotely like Hendrix as a guitarist. Not so I could play the guitar like Hendrix, but I could sort of get in the same ballpark. Joe Pass couldn't even play one note that was the equivalent of what he was doing. That seemed obvious to me. And so I didn't quite buy into this rock and prog musicians being the best. When I'd started playing the drums, my dad had a Billy Cobham album. And he had Buddy Rich albums, but it was the Billy Cobham album because the Billy Cobham album he was playing sort of rock-based music. It was the album Crosswinds. And so whatever album I bought, you know, however good the drumming was on a Rush album, I would then go and listen to Crosswinds by Billy Cobham. And I was a drummer, so I knew. I struggled, but I could play some of the Rush stuff. I could play some of those rolls and fills. I understand what was going on. I didn't have a chance, you know. It took me a year as a kid just to understand one of the time signatures on Crosswinds. There's a track in 1716. It took me a year to understand it and to be able to get my head around just to play at that speed in that time signature. You know, Cobham is an innovator. Cobham came along and changed the way we divide time, changed the way we play time. When you hear, and I'm using time signatures as an example, of a virtuoso example. If you listen to the development of odd time playing in jazz, pop, rock music, you know, it starts with Take 5. It runs through a whole bunch of bands in the 60s like the Don Ellis Orchestra, and then it's pushed to a max by the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Billy Cobham. That's the sort of route for on-time signatures. Every prog drummer that is playing in on-time signatures has got that from jazz musicians. So this is then another thing. A lot of the innovation that happens on the instruments, guitar-based drums, keyboards, a lot of those innovations are coming from jazz musicians. But also, you may argue, yes, but it's not just that. There's a classical influence, you know. So Rick Wakeman, you know, it was always lauded that Rick Wakeman had gone to the Royal College of Music, and he was a classical pianist, and whether he finished his degree at the Royal College of Music is neither here nor there. Yeah, he is a classical musician. He is classically trained. Without a doubt, he's a fantastic keyboardist. Is he the greatest, most virtuoso classical keyboardist in the world? No. None of these musicians would survive in the classical world if you put them against the greatest classical musicians. That's where the ultimate virtuosity is in music, is in classical music. So these are all middling players that have had classical training and then gone into rock music. You know, they can't do what jazz musicians do. They cannot do what rock musicians do. But a sort of myth emerges around them. You know, this idea that, you know, the Carl Palmers and the Neil Pearts and the John Bonhams, it happens with him, are the greatest technical drummers of all time. Now, in the music industry, there's two types of musicians. There's musicians that form bands, right? And their geniuses, and this is what the genius of prog is. Their genius is to find other musicians that they gel with, and then create a sound that's specific to them. Often a sound that's innovatory, which pushes the music form forward. Many bands have done this. You know, the Ramones did it. The Sex Pistols did it. Joy Division did it. All these bands did that. And it has nothing to do with virtuosity. It has to do with vision and creativity. And I would say that's what the great prog bands have. Right, so there's those types of musicians. And then there's musicians that you call up because you need them to do a job. And they're going to walk in and they have to be able to play whatever is going. You know, they've got to be able to read everything. They've got to be able to improvise. They've got to be able to do what people say on the drop of the hat, memorize huge amounts of stuff and move on. They've got to get the feel right. They've got to, you know, negotiate the other musicians. They've got to have a wide knowledge of music theory so they can adapt themselves to different styles and different stuff going on. They're session musicians. Now, if you want to know where the greatest musicians are in this music industry, or were in the old music industry when people still played, it's session musicians. It's musicians like Steve Gadd. It's musicians like Vinnie Colaiuta, right? It's musicians like Simon Phillips. You know, when I was a kid, I liked Judas Priest, but which was my favourite Judas Priest album? It was Sin After Sin, where they pulled in a 20-year-old Simon Phillips to come and play drums because they hadn't got a drummer. And Simon came in and did better drumming on that than any other drummer they ever had. On that day, he could just walk in and really redefine rock drumming for me. You know, there's a track on there called Dissident Aggression. I think this is about 1977. And it's really, in terms of thrash metal, what's going to come, it's groundbreaking. And part of that is because of Simon's double bass drumming on that track, which is incredible. So he's actually innovating as well. But that was a session for Simon Phillips. Go and listen to it. Go and listen to his drumming. It's the best drumming on any Judas Priest album. Because Simon could do that. And then the next day Simon would be working on a film soundtrack and reading that. And then the next day he's playing Latin American music, you know. Simon Phillips has gone from playing with Mick Jagger to playing with Hiromi. These are the greatest musicians in our history of rock music. It's the session guys. It's the guys that can play absolutely anything, right? And where do they crop up? On all sorts of different recordings. Now, yes, some of the prog musicians, I can hear you shout, were session musicians, you know. And yeah, it takes someone like Phil Collins. Phil Collins has worked as much doing session work. We can come up with a list. But this is the odd thing. Phil Collins often gets mentioned to be as being a drummer that's not very good. You know, that the general public perceive him as being sort of, you know, in the same bracket as Ringo Starr, as though Ringo Starr's not very good. It's the same thing happening over and over again. Sorry to keep using drum as an example, but it's it's the instrument I play, as you can see in the background, and it's what I know about. The Beatles weren't very good musicians. They're just some kids from Liverpool, right? When they got into the studio, they got great songs. They need to be on the album because they're the ones singing the songs, but they heard their drummer and the drummer couldn't cut it. George Martin knew that, so he goes, go and get another drummer. So they went and got a session player in. Local session player. I'm not saying Ringo is Steve Gadd or Vinnie Colaiuta or Harvey Mason. I'm not saying that at all. But he was a session player and he came in and he cut it. You know why? Because he was a good musician. You want to know who the best musician was in the Beatles? It was Ringo, right? If you play the drums and you listen to it and you watch what he's doing, there's some chops there, but they're more important, there's the ability to hold time and command yourself in the studio and hold that band down. That's really, really hard. To play consistent for your snare drum to be the same every single time it comes around. That's really, really hard. In a band, the band sits on that. If that's not right, and so if that's not right, it's not going to work. And so what do you have to do? They have to bring session musicians in. It's happened through the history of music. You know how many albums where it says that that's the drummer or that's the guitarist on it. And they're not. They're session players. Ringo was a session player. I'm not saying he was a top session player. He was a local session player in Liverpool, but I think he was the best musician in the Beatles. I honestly do. But that's not the general consensus, because this snobbery, that snobbery we're talking about, is the snobbery that ends up with people going, oh, prog is the best because they're the best players in the world. But it's not the case. And I hope I'm slowly making the argument for this. But Phil Collins is. Phil Collins is a fantastic drummer. Right, what's the evidence for this? Well, if you play, go and listen to him play in Brand X. Right, he's an incredible drummer. Right, he is at a much technical higher level than his classic rock contemporaries like, Ian Pace and John Bonham. Phil Collins really, really can play. I don't think Bonham could have played some of the stuff that's on those Brand X. Bonham's an incredible drummer. Bonham again is almost like a local session drummer. When you see this happening, which of course is what happens with Genesis, isn't it? They have their mate playing drums and he's okay, and then once he goes, they have to go and find somebody and they audition, and of course they have the choice and they bring in someone like Phil Collins. Led Zeppelin was made out of session players. That's what they were, monster musicians. So Bonham's got some chops and he probably could play the Brand X stuff, But was he top end session playing? Is he on the same level? Could he pull off what a Steve Gadd could do? Walk into a room where he hasn't heard the material, look down at the chart, play the chart, which is not a drum chart, it's a piano chart. Not hurting the minute, get the take done in one, get paid, go home. They're the monster musicians, right? I do not class myself as that type of musician. I didn't come up through that sort of training as a musician. I'm what I call a rock musician. I learnt to play by ear. And what interests in me in music is creativity and individuality. It's being able to come up with something that people haven't done before. Now, prog musicians have that in buckets. These session players often have to disappear into the mix. They have to not do something which shows off what they do. They've got to come up with high creative solutions, but not necessarily creative solutions where they become the star, right? But with prog musicians, if someone was to play me, let's take the great prog drummers all the time, someone was to play me Carl Palmer, followed by Bill Bruford, followed by, say, come on, get your Neil Peart, followed by Phil Collins, those four drummers. And I'm sure you would be able to recognise them in the drop of a hat. So strong is their signature. That's what makes them great players, not the virtuosity, not the cleverness of their compositions, their ability to compose stuff. God, the average TV theme composer could out-compose most prog composers. I know people are going to hate me saying this. That's not what it's about. The composition's important with prog because it's innovative, because it's groundbreaking. So I'm going to return back to this, I think. this prog snobbery thing. I'm hoping that this video does throw up a few comments and I can actually use those comments, because a lot of my videos are based upon comments in the, you know, the comments below the video, the ones down there, you know, those comments is what give me ideas for the next video. So anyway, I'm going to finish up there. I think I've talked about that enough. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you on the next one. See you all. Thank you. Bye.